leaving Ferrari at the end of the 2020 season. Now, a quick bit of housekeeping first for those of us, for those of you following this on YouTube. We want to hear what your thoughts are on this, so please do comment, and we'll hopefully get to some of your best questions later on. With me on the show, Autosport's F1 reporter. I've screwed that up immediately. That's a good start. Anyway, joining me on this show are Luke Smith, Stuart Codling, and Jess McFadden. Welcome, guys. I hope you're all as captivated and interested in this news of Sebastian Vettel leaving as I am. So, Luke, perhaps we'll start with you, seeing as I noticed from your Instagram story you were up at around about 3 a.m. writing about Sebastian Vettel, which is a situation ideally no one wants to find themselves in, but it is obviously quite a major breaking story. So, for anyone that isn't aware of what's going on, can you run us through what's happened?
Sure. So we obviously have been following this story for a number of weeks, number of months about Sebastian Vettel and his contract talks with Ferrari going into the future. His contract was up at the end of this year. Ferrari were known to be looking for revised terms with him. He's always gone for a 3-year contract with Ferrari. He's always been one of the highest paid drivers in the sport. But obviously with Charles Leclerc's emergence last year and a new 5-year contract, Vettel no longer quite had the power he once had at Ferrari. So there were talks between him and the team as to what that new contract would look like on a reduced wage, on a reduced contract length as well. And then it had been quite quiet for a little while. I mean, both parties said for a long time that they were committed to getting a deal done. It was all looking pretty positive. And it's been quiet for a few weeks. And then late last night, we had our German colleagues got in touch saying that they heard that Sebastian was going to be leaving Ferrari and that news would be confirmed on Tuesday morning. And the story sort of gathered steam overnight. So, meant another late night covering a Vettel shock departure, brought back memories of Suzuka 2014 as well, which was a very similar story. Then it was confirmed this morning by Ferrari announcing that Sebastian Vettel will be leaving the team at the end of the season. Vettel made clear that financial considerations were never a factor in the discussions, but he wanted to reassess what is important in his life. That was kind of the message we were getting from it. Quite interesting. He talked about the pandemic break that we've had as well. It's sort of given him a chance to maybe reflect a little bit more, maybe reassess where things are in his life. And in the end, they jointly decided to call off talks, meaning that Sebastian Vettel will be leaving Ferrari at the end of the year.
Well, thank you very much for that summary, Luke. It's pretty big. The news of the season so far, and obviously it's very sadly because of the coronavirus crisis, a season that hasn't even started yet. Jess, going to come to you next. How did you react when you heard the news last night, this morning, when things broke?
Yeah, I don't envy Luke having to be up at 3 a.m. because I awoke to the news. But yeah, it's not something I think that a lot of people thought they were going to be getting, especially not right now. But I think the biggest thing for me is that a lot of people kind of going into the season, especially when Leclerc and Verstappen had their long-term deals at their respective teams kind of solidified, that we weren't going to have much of a silly season. But this is just essentially blown that wide open, which is kind of the most interesting thing from my perspective, not to kind of glaze over the fact that one of F1's most successful drivers is no longer going to be at one of the most successful teams. But that to me is kind of what I think a lot of people are talking about. Obviously, I think for a lot of people, the writing was maybe on the wall. There'd been quite a lot of speculation about his future in any case. And obviously with the youngster Leclerc coming along last season and kind of giving him a big run for his money, there were always these questions about, is he going to stay? Is he going to leave? Is he going to be happy with a young buck outperforming him on track? He's never really been one to stick around once a younger guy starts showing his colors. So I personally wasn't hugely surprised. But I guess one of the things that came out of this entire kind of headline as well is that his statement in the Ferrari press release was that he's taken this time away from F1 to reestablish his priorities, which I thought was interesting because it links back to Lewis saying that he was actually considering taking a sabbatical from F1 in any case, and that he's kind of been given it because of this lockdown. And maybe these two greats of F1 have kind of actually quite enjoyed not racing, and maybe it's a case of he's not quite said if he's going to retire or if he's going to stay in racing, but it seems that he's quite enjoyed the break.
Absolutely. I think a lot of speculation, a lot of interest in what Vettel does next is going to take a main point of our discussion, and also, you know, captivate people's fans, be observers of the championship. What happens next is going to take up a lot of our time and our analysis in the coming months. Now, Codders, what did you feel when you heard the news? Was there a particular reference, a particular topical thing that you could liken this to? And also, what do you think Vettel might do next?
Well, I thought that the phrasing of it, talking about reassessing his priorities, was a little bit kind of like a tricky breakup, wasn't it? You know, it's not you, it's me, kind of thing. For me, the fact that it came, the initial reports came from our friends in Germany, suggested to me that maybe this information has come from Camp Vettel itself, actually, and either he's trying to control the news agenda in some way, or he's putting a signal flare up to other teams, other interested parties, to say, look, I'm available from next year onwards. So maybe trying to kickstart negotiations there. On the other hand, you have to say that if you're going to walk away from the negotiating table with Ferrari, you probably need to have a little bit of a deal in place already. So maybe he is already in conversation with some people. And there have obviously been a lot of other names linked with potentially replacing him. And if someone moves from another team to replace him at Ferrari, perhaps he could slot in there, depending on where that is. It all depends on whether he wants to continue in Formula One or not, because obviously we have Fernando Alonso hanging around on the sidelines, hoping to get a foothold in any potential vacancy.
Indeed, and it's almost not worth breaking up the two sides of who could replace Vettel and where could Vettel go, because they're almost inexplicably linked, really. Now, Luke, what do you think? What do you see as? Maybe we'll frame it first of all with that. What do you see as Vettel's options? Because it was interesting. He did an interview with our motorsport.com colleague Roberto Quincaro in Melbourne. It was a wide-ranging interview. We used it on Autosport magazine and on Autosport Plus. And Vettel sort of suggested that, you know, Kimi Räikkönen, his former teammate, went to Alfa Romeo. You know, it was Sauber then at the time when he joined, and it became Alfa Romeo for last season. But Vettel didn't sort of go, yep, that's exactly what I want to do. I just want to be about the racing. I don't care what team I drive for. He was like, well, I'm not really sure that once I've raced at the front, I've fought for world titles. Is it really what I want to do, to go back to the midfield and be scrapping just to make the points or make Q3 or whatever? So what do you think he might do? And really, is retirement an option for him?
I think it is a big option for him. And when this news was announced, I immediately thought of, there's a quote from Mark Webber that he gave in 2014, saying that he predicted Vettel would do everything early in his life, that he would win his titles early, he would have kids early, have a family early, and he would retire early as well. And Vettel, he's 32, 33. So that is all ringing very, very true right now, I think. And yeah, as you rightly say, like Seb in that interview with Roberto, he never said that, oh yeah, I want to keep on racing well into my 40s like Kimi and sort of always be part of the F1 furniture. He talked about sort of happiness and about what makes him happy in his life. And I think it's interesting, sort of that family side of it, and that this has been a time when all of the drivers and everyone in F1 really has sort of had a chance to spend time with their families and do something in a season that they would never normally get. In Seb's case, he has got a young baby boy that was born last November, and he would never have been afforded the sort of precious time that a parent would ordinarily have with a child. He would never have got that normally, but now he has. I just wonder whether that's maybe sort of part of the reassessment that he's talked about and maybe is sort of rethinking. Yeah, so I think retirement, it is a serious option, I think, because if he doesn't want to do what Kimi's doing and just keep racing because he loves it and for the fun of it, then I think he'll see no reason to. I think he'll think, well, I may as well spend that time with my family and enjoy my sort of quiet life that I've established. But I think if he wants to find a seat, then I think he will be able to. I think there's a few options that will sort of move around once Ferrari decide who they want to replace him at Maranello. But I think that's really a question for Seb to sort of answer. And as maybe he has sort of reassessing these priorities as he talks about, I think to walk away from Ferrari, that's a big thing. But to walk away from F1 altogether, like it's going to be interesting to see whether he can do one without doing the other.
Absolutely. Now, Jess, you mentioned, as you were speaking earlier on, about what's happened in Vettel's past when Daniel Ricciardo joined him at Red Bull in 2014. They were there for a season. Ricciardo outperformed him. Vettel left, went to Ferrari. The dream was fresh and new, and now it's happened again. Charles Leclerc has rocked up, outperformed him. They've clashed on track, high-profile incident in Brazil, and now he's going again. Obviously, there is still hope. We hope there's a season going to happen in 2020, and who knows? Vettel could win the title. It's not outside the realms of possibility, but we think that judging by Ferrari's form in testing, that is a bit of an outside shot. But all things considered, with what's happened with Ricciardo and what's happened now with Leclerc, do you think that impacts Vettel's reputation and his status within F1?
I think, and I'm actually seeing some comments coming in on YouTube at the moment going, you guys are far too harsh on Vettel. He's a 4-time world champion. He's got all these records against his name. And that is completely and utterly valid. I don't think we're particularly being harsh on him. We're just stating facts. You've just stated that when Ricciardo came along, he didn't exactly like being outperformed by a young up-and-comer, because obviously that was his role, right? He was the young up-and-comer. He won in the Toro Rosso. He had all this amazing future in front of him, and not that this is always a big question, isn't it? It's when does an F1 great, if we're going to use that word, kind of peak, and when do we start kind of looking at them to go, it's probably time to go out to pasture and maybe do a bit of a Kimmy, and just, we love seeing you because you've got fans and you've done brilliant things, but are you really going to win again? And I think we saw in the 2017, 2018, he had a real shot, and I don't think we can ever take that away from him. He gave us great battles with Hamilton, but ultimately Hamilton, for reasons I think both Ferrari led and a few mistakes on Vettel's hand, it didn't come to him, and as you've said, I don't know if Ferrari have got the package. Obviously we didn't get to really see much outside of testing, but it wasn't looking altogether like it was going to happen. So especially with Charles Leclerc in that second Ferrari seat, if anybody was going to take it to Hamilton, it's definitely going to be Leclerc. So it's a funny one, and I think that we can't take it away from Vettel what he's achieved in his career. I think we can look back on it, and he should look back on it with absolute fondness and with pride. But it does get to a point where Ferrari are looking towards their future. Is Vettel the right person for that seat? Even if it was Vettel that negotiated his way out of the contract because it just didn't fit with him, it is to do with looking forward and seeing as to whether that's the right pairing. And I think that's what's on everyone's lips at the moment. It's what is that pairing in Ferrari going to look like?
Absolutely, and I think you're right there to emphasise that Vettel will without a doubt will go down as one of F1's greats. You don't win 4 world titles and not be able to do that. It is just interesting to see that a pattern emerges with Ricciardo, with Leclerc, and him leaving the teams there. And you referenced 2017, 2018 there. And I think 2018 will be one that Vettel really must look back on. I think that's where I let it get away from me, because the Ferrari was capable of taking it to the Mercedes over that season, and unfortunately it was his errors starting in Germany that let it really unravel. And it leads you to wonder, would Lewis Hamilton, had he been in the Ferrari at the time, would he have lost that title? And I think the conclusion that you almost have to be drawn to is that he probably would have done, because as we've seen when they've gone wheel to wheel, it has been Hamilton that hasn't made the mistakes that Vettel was shown. Again, this is not to be massively down on Sebastian Vettel. I think he achieved some phenomenal things in Formula One. The racing he did in 2010, in 2011, 2012, all those title years was truly phenomenal. He got a lot of stick for not being able to race. Never understood that. He put in some brilliant moves and was genuinely, as I say, one of Formula One's greats. Now, Codders, I want to come to you, because it's interesting as we're talking about that. It's like I said, everything's linked in this debate and this topic. The decision today, Ferrari and Vettel both said it was a joint decision that they're not going to be working together. Now, I've sort of suggested there, and what I think is that Vettel was to blame potentially for Ferrari losing the 2018 world title, but at the same time, Ferrari really hasn't given him all that many cars with which he could take on Lewis Hamilton. So it's a joint decision that they're leaving each other, but surely Ferrari must take some blame for the fact that the dream scenario at the start of 2015 hasn't come to pass.
It's a sorry tale of mutual disappointment, I think, which is, it's always a shame when a relationship any relationship, but in this case, in Formula One, that a driver comes to a team and they have great expectations of each other, and those those expectations don't come to fruition. And yes, you're right. I think Ferrari do have to shoulder some of the blame, because if we look back earlier in Vettel's career, okay, so with Red Bull, he had a fantastically downforce endowed car. The exhaust blown diffusers perfectly played to his skill set. He was able to do tricks with that car that maybe no one else could. And you look, he absolutely wiped the floor with his teammate Mark Webber. We've quoted Mark Webber's comments about him, but the fact is that he made Mark Webber look very, very ordinary in the Red Bull. Shorn of that sort of the exhaust blown diffuser thing, we did see him come up short against a teammate in a poor car in 2014, and that year against Ricciardo in Red Bull, you have to say how much of it was Ricciardo, how much of it was Vettel's motivation slipping, because the car was appalling. If we move on to Ferrari, 2015, he had a good car. He did well. He was expecting better in 2016, but the 2016 car was not a measurable improvement. So maybe that's when the rot started to set in. When they did give him a better car, 2017, 2018, much better cars, competitive for the World Championship, but there were also organizational problems, operational problems. There was discord behind the scenes, and he is a sensitive personality. I think he feeds off positive energy, but he's also affected by negative energy. Ferrari was a very troubled team throughout the Maurizio Arrivabene era. So even with having such a competitive car, I'm not sure he quite scaled the heights that possibly his talent deserved. So yeah, I wouldn't put it at 50-50, but I do think he's not got as much out of Ferrari as perhaps they should have given him.
Completely. Now, as we sort of alluded to earlier, there are some early favourites from the drivers among the grid that could potentially take Vettel's seat. I think we've got to look at Daniel Ricciardo, out of contract at Renault. Is he committed to that project for the long term? We know there was a lot of interest, a lot of news when that first came about in 2018. Then you've got Antonio Giovinazzi. He's in Ferrari's seat at Alfa Romeo. Could easily slot in alongside Leclerc. And then, of course, there's Carlos Sainz Jr. at McLaren. Did a very, very good job last year. Highly rated driver. Showed very well against Max Verstappen, I thought, when they were teammates at Toro Rosso. So of those three, Luke, what do you think of their chances of potentially moving up? And I think perhaps we'll come on to discuss some of the high-profile names also on the grid and off the grid that might come into the debate later on.
Yeah, there's a wide array of names that are being linked with this seat already. I'm sure Mattia Binotto woke up this morning to a long list of missed calls and voicemails on his phone of people wanting to get interested in the seat. The names you mentioned there, Daniel Ricciardo is an obvious option. I think he's probably the quickest out-and-out driver who is realistically available to Ferrari right now for next year. As you said, he joined Renault for 2019 as part of a long-term project. 2021 was always their goal, for that to be the season they really become competitive and give Ricciardo the chance to fight for wins, possibly a world championship. But I think some of Ricciardo's confidence in the Renault project would have been dented by last year. It was a very difficult season. The team dropped from 4th to 5th in the Constructors' Championship, struggled to be a real force at the front of the midfield, let alone bridge the gaps to the top three teams. So I think it would be surprising if he wasn't interested in move to Ferrari. I think he would be a good option. But there is obviously the question mark over whether him and Leclerc would be able to fit together. I mean, Leclerc is, I think, clearly going to be the number one driver from now on, the man Ferrari want to lead them in the future. Ricciardo, I don't know if he would slot in too happily with a young upstart teammate, maybe similar to what he found at Red Bull with Max Verstappen, obviously. So that I think is the big question mark there. You mentioned Antonio Giovinazzi. I think Ferrari, if they did want to sort of commit to having a good sort of junior program moving forward, I think then, yeah, potentially that could be an option. But I just don't see him having enough experience or having really shown enough in F1 yet to justify having that seat. I think his first season with Alfa Romeo was so, not great, not brilliant. Leclerc showed from day one at Sauber what he could do. So I think a world of difference between those two. And then you got Carlos Sainz, who I think is the real sort of, I would say he's the favourite for the seat right now. I think he was very impressive with McLaren last year. I think he proved that he has got the potential to really be sort of a good front-running driver. I think comparable to maybe how Valtteri Bottas was with Williams, sort of really impressing and punching above his weight in the midfield. And also, I don't think he would rock the boat too much with Leclerc and with Ferrari. I think he would slot in quite nicely to that whole setup. So, yeah, I think those are probably the leading three names right now. I think probably you say Ricciardo and Sainz are probably the two favourites. But if I had to put money on anyone right now, it would probably be on Carlos Sainz Jr.
We've actually had a fan question come in. We've had a fan question come in from Thomas Freeberg, who actually kind of alludes to one of the points you made, Luke, which was, don't you think Ferrari will aim for a wingman for Leclerc that is ready to help Leclerc win the championship? Are they going to take a mark out of Mercedes' book, dare we say?
Yeah, and that could be an option for them, because I think Ferrari, you look at obviously the great sort of Schumacher-Barrichello partnership, it was very, very clear where the balance of power lay there. And even with Alonso, when he was leading the team, and Vettel, when he had Kimi Raikkonen as a teammate, Raikkonen was always a brilliant foil for Vettel. He was always sort of good and a decent number two, but never quite quick enough to worry Vettel. And it was clear who the team rallied around. And I think now we're sort of looking at a similar thing that, yeah, Ferrari, I think they'll want to find someone who can obviously push Leclerc and sort of bring out the very best in him. But I don't think they're looking for someone who can beat Charles Leclerc on a sort of week in, week out basis. So that is why I would have big sort of question marks over whether Ricciardo would be a real good fit there.
What about Nico Hülkenberg? He's been close to Ferrari before. He might occupy a compliant number two role, and he makes fewer mistakes than Antonio Giovinazzi. Interesting left field suggestion. Feel free to crucify me in the comments, but I'd quite happily see Nico Hülkenberg in a Ferrari.
And then he might actually get a podium, which would be brilliant for him to actually tie up his F1 career with a podium. That would be, goals for him, wouldn't it?
Then
Squad
there'll
goals,
be the
definitely.
inevitable crash at Baku, I think, if Hülkenberg was in the Ferrari. Now, it's interesting. Everybody's making very sensible suggestions about what Ferrari could do, taking in a driver that might not, upset Leclerc. But Ferrari have already proved that they've gone against their history by hiring Leclerc in the first place. He was only a year in at Sauber when he got the Ferrari drive. So potentially they could make a more wild left field choice. Maybe something they think that, it's worth trying to get a big name. Like, for instance, Lewis Hamilton. We know the two sides have talked to each other already. And considering at the moment there's nothing happening, there's no racing going on, we should definitely speculate about this. So, Jess, you mentioned earlier very correctly that the silly season had sort of gone a bit cold. So, for instance, like Leclerc was tied to his long-term contract at Ferrari, Verstappen at Red Bull. The Hamilton-Mercedes contract talks nothing's really come along at this particular point. There's all sorts of questions about what will happen to Mercedes in Formula One now because of the pandemic. There was already question marks about would they leave anyway because they'd achieved so much. Toto Wolff and all the interesting things going on around him, potentially at Aston Martin. He's bought into the team a little bit, into the road car company a little bit. So it's no guarantee that Lewis Hamilton will even stay at Mercedes next year, and we haven't even had any racing in 2020 yet. What do you think the likelihood of him going to Ferrari is? Ferrari haven't had the best car for recent years, but they're going to be using the same car in 2020 and 2021, so there's no guarantee of titles. But yet it's Ferrari. It's what ultimately almost every driver, I'm sure, that's the dream job, really. So yeah, what do you think the likelihood of that happening is?
Yeah, everyone's been adamant at Mercedes, haven't they, that Mercedes are always going to be in a position to attract the best driver on the grid, and that's currently Lewis Hamilton. And Lewis has said, I am happy in my Mercedes family, and I'm happy with where I am, and why would I, turn my back on six world titles, 5 of which I've had with the team. It's just, the rhetoric has been very much like, I'm not going anywhere. But I think the one thing that keeps coming out, especially from, I think, the fan perspective, is if Lewis Hamilton could win in a Ferrari that hasn't won in, how long since they've last won a title? It was Kimi, right? So but I think in terms of tying up his career, I don't think there could be very many doubters if he was then to be able to pull off a world title with Ferrari. And what a career that would be with all of those accolades under his belt. So I think the fans would love to see it. I don't know how the Ferrari fans would react. But I think the wider F1 fandom would quite happily see Hamilton in red, and competing with the Mercedes no longer being there. I mean, dare I say, maybe it would give Bottas a chance. I don't know, but it's an interesting one, for sure. And I don't think people are putting him as an outlier right now for that seat, and saying that Ricciardo and Sainz are maybe better fits, more likely fits. But I don't see. I mean, Lewis must have woken up this morning wherever he is in the world, some exotic location, rubbed his hands, because it gives him more power. If a seat like that is there for the taking, then he's got more negotiation power, to either stay at Mercedes or to get a lovely little deal going on at Ferrari. Personally, I'd quite like to see Vettel and Hamilton as teammates. I think it probably ruined the bromance that they've got going on, that everyone seems to be obsessed with at the moment as well. But I think, have two multiple world champions in the same team could be hugely fiery, but I think it'd give us a great show.
I completely agree with that. And also just say, if there are any Ferrari fans out there that are seriously against Lewis Hamilton joining your team, I think you need to have a good long hard look at yourself, because why wouldn't you want the best driver of his era in that red car? I think it'd be first fantastic to see, and also just it would just be tremendous for the team as well. Codders, what about the real outsider? Because like Nico Hülkenberg, he's outside of Formula One, but also he might have burnt his bridges at Ferrari. He might have burnt his bridges in Formula One totally. Fernando Alonso. He said recently he knows what his plans are for 2021. Well, might they have just changed? Or is he hinting at something potentially he already knew about the Vettel news? Who knows? What do you think the likelihood of Fernando Alonso returning to Ferrari is for next season?
Well, people talk about Fernando Alonso saying that his plans were sorted for 2021, but really, were they? I'm always reminded of the story of the the record company A&R man who badgered Kate Bush after many years of not recording an album into divulging what she was up to, and after a while she said, "Okay, well, come round the house and I'll show you what I've been up to." And the man duly turned up, and she invited him in. She opened her oven, pulled out a tray of rock cakes, and said, "This is what I've been working on." And to my mind, people like to think that they know or have an idea of what Fernando Alonso's planning. He likes to give an impression that he's got plans. What did he have in mind? I'm sure he'd look at that Ferrari driver and think, I could at least be competitive in that. And he's obviously, he's interested in racing. He's got plans around the Indy 500. He obviously has that sort of Triple Crown ambition still. The question is, as you say, would he want to go back to Ferrari? Would Ferrari want him back? He did burn a few bridges, but then again, his beef seems to have been with the senior management, who've since been axed. So the question is, was he that difficult to work with that the present management will have had the notification from above that you do not employ this person under any circumstances? It's quite tricky, isn't it, when you have a driver who's so fantastically talented and so fantastically quick, but also so fantastically temperamental and difficult to manage at times.
Absolutely. Now, we'll come on to our last sort of in-house or internal questions that we were going to discuss together, and then perhaps we'll have a little look again at the questions you guys have been submitting on YouTube. Luke, one last thing. We talked about the idea of maybe Carlos Sainz being the favourite. Well, if he does go to Ferrari, and of course this is all speculation. Naturally, we don't know what's going to happen in the future. If he were to go to Ferrari and all the outside contenders like Lewis Hamilton stays at Mercedes, Fernando Alonso doesn't get back in, he goes off, does the back car again, things like that. But Carlos Sainz goes to Ferrari, leaves a hole at McLaren. Do we think it's most likely that would be filled by Ricciardo or Vettel? Because of course there's a flip side to the Mercedes equation, in that Mercedes might quite like Vettel to drive for his team if they're still going to be about, or use his engines, which will be in the McLaren from 2021. But equally, it's just things aren't just that simple. Logic, things that make sense in our head, certainly in my head, doesn't necessarily translate into the complex negotiations of Formula One. So what could be the domino effect here, and how would this affect other drivers on the grid?
Well, yeah, I think firstly, it'll all depend on Ferrari making a decision. If they want to make a very quick decision, which wouldn't surprise me, given that they've already decided this with Vettel, then that would, I think, set things off. So let's say theoretically they decide, let's go with Carlos Sainz, get him signed up. McLaren were trying to get Sainz signed up much, much earlier this year. They talked about a new contract over the winter, but nothing was agreed as far as we know. So I think that may come back to bite McLaren a little bit. But they've always been quite clear about this sort of long-term plan to rebuild. And I think as nice and as fun and as much as I think of we have all loved the Carlos Sainz, Lando Norris partnership, it hasn't quite had a big star name that I think McLaren would maybe have been craving. You look back when it was Alonso and Button together, obviously like through the mid-2000s when they had Kimi there, Hakkinen, there's always been sort of a big start. And it was quite nice to begin with. Like you had this sort of new humility, I think, from McLaren when it was Sainz and Norris together. But I think if they want to make a big statement going forward, I think getting a big name, be it Vettel or Ricciardo, I think that would be huge for them going into 2021 with the Mercedes engines coming in as well. The budget cap for the future, they're very confident that they could be competitive once again. Now, I think that for Vettel, I think it would be quite attractive because it would be a chance to be with a team that has been struggling for a long time, has got a rich history in Formula One, and it would maybe be sort of the last chance to sort of really try and rebuild the project, much as he maybe did at Ferrari and didn't quite achieve all his goals. But I don't think there'll be the same kind of pressure as maybe there was at Ferrari. It'd be a case of, look, you're going to dip down to midfield team. If the budget cap plays out nicely and things go well, this could be a real great story to end your career with a stint at McLaren and return them to glory. Otherwise, there's not really a lot lost, to be honest. But then for McLaren, they may also think, well, is Ricciardo a quicker option? Is he the better guy? Are we better off going with him moving forward? Would he be easier to work with than Vettel, perhaps? Would he have a couple of extra years in F1 as well, sort of thinking really long term? I think for either driver, I think it is an attractive option. I think if Ricciardo misses out on a Ferrari seat, I think he would probably look to McLaren as being a good bet for the future. We know they had some talks for 2019 when he decided to move to Renault instead. So I think there's a good couple of options for McLaren on the table there. I think as Jess said, Lewis Hamilton is a big winner from all of this because his value has just gone up a lot because there is now a serious option elsewhere that he can go to Mercedes and say, well, that's what you're competing against. But I think also McLaren will think, look, at worst, they're going to have Carlos Sainz continuing with the team, which would be a really great thing for them to continue with. But then if they don't have Sainz, they could have Ricciardo or they could have Vettel. And for them to have one of the most coveted seats in the F1 midfield, I think is a really, really good thing for them. So I think, McLaren can be in a pretty good spot. Renault, I think they will probably be looking at, well, if we lose Ricciardo, do we want to sort of look at Vettel? Do we want to look at Sainz even? Would he be an option to go back there? I'm not so sure. Fernando Alonso, does he come back into the picture there? There's so many drivers that can move around. And I think it's just really cool that silly season, it looked like it was going to be a real non-event this year. Everyone was going to continue. And now it's all been blown out of the water. So I think it's going to be a really, really fiery few months of action coming up.
Absolutely, and I think we have to thank Sebastian Vettel and Ferrari for giving us something to talk about during this time when there's no racing on. Now, Jess, do we have any comments that we want to throw in? Any questions we can answer from the viewers?
We have many comments and a few questions, but there's a lot. Everyone's very vocal, and but it seems from what I can gather, Ricciardo looks to be a popular candidate for that Ferrari seat. I think, and from a lot of what people have said, it's more people want to get Ricciardo out of Renault from the looks of things. I think the last season was quite a pain season, which we all knew was going to happen anyway. I think it's what he probably thought he was signing up for, but maybe not as painful as we ended up having. So he looks like he's a dead cert. A lot of people are saying that Vettel should just retire and kind of end on a high, being in a Ferrari seat and then ending. I mean, arguably, is it a high? I don't know. I mean, as we've said, he's got so much. Oh, Codders is shaking his head. It's not high for you then, is it, Codders?
No, because as I said earlier, he hasn't for a lot of his Ferrari career. He just hasn't had the right car. He hasn't had a car to suit his skills, and a team of that caliber ought to be able to give their lead driver a car that he can work with. And you take last year for example, it was an understeering mess, and it wasn't until they put a new floor on it, etc., in Singapore that the car improved. And if you're going to pay a 4-time world champion to come and drive for you, then give him a car that suits his skill set, or hire someone that can drive any car.
That does seem to be the weird thing, doesn't it? Sorry, Alex, you go.
I was going to say very quickly, I find the Renault thing genuinely fascinating, because it's interesting, that there's still they've got Ricciardo on this big money, big news deal, and yet it's not quite worked out. They weren't close to the top 3 as they were expecting to last season, and he's obviously he's not come out with the right, we're staying together with this big project for the long term. And also, what I just think makes this whole scenario, this whole driver market thing, absolutely even more fascinating, but it's also got a really scary and a really worrying aspect to it as well, is the pandemic. What is going to happen with Renault in the future? Are they going to be committed to Formula One? So how can a driver, how can they either be expecting to get a big salary from there, or also just get a long commitment? So it's the same with Mercedes as well. It adds an extra dynamic. Hopefully, fingers crossed, it's not as serious as all that, but it's got to be factored in. So yeah, I think either it's just interesting to see how many teams have suddenly become big players, and also it's taking a step back as well with Renault, if we're considering, actually might this not be a place where drivers want to be? It's just all fascinating. Anyway, sorry, Jess, I interrupted you there.
No, it's fine. It's fine. I'm actually I need to give Barry Heron a shout out, because he is littering the comment section, begging us to talk about Bottas. We've not really mentioned him as a contender, but they're all saying, why aren't you considering Bottas as a move to Ferrari? Out of the shadow of Hamilton, would he be able to take on Leclerc? That's what so Barry is saying, what about Bottas, and how would he unsettle Ferrari's biggest rival? So what do we think about Bottas taking that Ferrari seat?
I think that's a really good option, actually. I think it would be a driver who's a proven race winner, can play that number 2 role well, is very easy to work with. I mean, Lewis Hamilton is, so great. Like, you've got to be quite careful, I think, when you're working alongside Lewis Hamilton, as I think the relationship with Nico Rosberg proved in the past. So for Bottas to have worked so well with Lewis, and for Lewis to be so happy with Bottas, I think that proves just how valuable he is. And I think, as Barry says, like, for Ferrari to nab one of their main rivals' drivers, that would be a huge thing. So I think Bottas would be, a really good shout. And I think that would be maybe more dependent on Mercedes deciding what they're doing. Every year we go through this same scenario of, are they going to carry on with Bottas for another year or not? But also that might actually sort of light the fire a little bit underneath Mercedes as well. Had some cars going around there. That they might actually have to make a decision. We did, yeah. They may now need to make a decision on what do they do with Bottas. And if he says, well, look, similar to Lewis, with this bargaining power, I've got this contract offer from Ferrari to join them. You need to decide, do you want to use me or lose me for next year? And that's another dynamic to throw in there. So yeah, I think Bottas would be a great shout. I really, really do. I think he would tick all of the boxes very, very nicely for Ferrari. But I think, again, for Bottas, does he really want to walk away from Mercedes right now? Knowing that Lewis is also entering the final sort of stages of his career as well. Does he want to walk away from a project where he could one day be the team leader? I'm not so sure. So, but yeah, no, I think he'll be a really, really good shout for Ferrari.
Another thing that we all
sorry, Chris, just very quickly, just to because I love this sort of speculation that these driver market stories generate, is that, okay, let's just assume everything works out as we all hope it does with the pandemic, right? This could have a massive knock-on effect for Mercedes and even for Williams, because if Bottas goes to Ferrari, suddenly Mercedes have got a seat. Could George Russell end up there? Could Esteban Ocon leave Renault? It's just I just love that sort of thing. Anyway, Codders, as you were saying.
I was just going to flag up the point that a lot of people forget, or it maybe doesn't enter their thoughts, that very often these people that we consider to be compliant number 2s, the wingmen as it were, do not think of themselves as wingmen. If you remember, there was a moderate amount of stink when Toto Wolff referred to Valtteri Bottas as a great wingman. We talk about the Schumacher and Barrichello years. Barrichello absolutely hated being number 2 to Michael Schumacher. If you think back to the Austrian Grand Prix in 2002, the whole reason for that hoo-ha was that Rubens waited until the very last minute to grudgingly and with his heels absolutely dug in to hand over the P1 to Michael, when it had been agreed the day before that he would hand over to Michael if they were running 1-2 with Rubens in front. So it's very much, it's almost a non-starter to think of a driver as thinking of themselves as a number 2. I can't imagine. I can't think of any successful top-level racing driver who has ever actually seriously been content to be number 2. Maybe someone like Giancarlo Fisichella, who just liked to be in Formula One, but I don't think anyone in Valtteri Bottas's position has it in their mindset to just be a number 2 and be sort of after you, Claude, and content with the crumbs from the table, as it were. And it's only because Valtteri is such a professional and so cool that when he gets the Valtteri, it's James message, he doesn't just sort of throw his toys out the pram straight away.
No, absolutely. I think I agree with you there, Codders. But maybe one driver that is content with being a number 2, which Rocky 30 has been absolutely spamming the chat function with, is could Kimi return to Ferrari as a compliant number 2 driver? I think it'd be a bit farcical. It'd be a bit like Massa's retirement and then coming back to Williams for that 1 year again, wouldn't it? It'd be a bit yikes, really.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm sure he'd be happy with it, but
I don't know. I think Kimi's enjoying his sort of final few years, and yeah, that would be really weird. It reminds me of in The Office, after David Brent gets fired, and then he keeps coming back just to say hello, and it's sort of a bit, it's all a bit weird. So I don't know. Again, great story though. This is what, as Alex, you were saying, like I love about silly season. Every single driver on the grid is going to be linked to that Ferrari seat. We've got so much to talk about now. Hopefully we can marry that up with some racing in the next couple of months, and we're back underway in July. But I mean, this is really, really going to get, I think, the F1 news-wise going for a long, long time. So it's going to be an exciting few weeks, I think.
Absolutely. Well, I think that makes sense as a point to wrap up on, Luke. We're looking forward to the future, all the news it's going to bring, and we hope to be writing and bringing you our best analysis on autosport.com and motorsport.com. And it's just going to be an interesting time in terms of a silly season, and fingers crossed when we get to it, an actual racing season as well, which we are all looking forward to. And we hope everyone is staying as safe and as well as they can be during these challenging times. I'd just like to say thank you very much for joining us today, whether that was you're following along on YouTube or listening to the podcast. We do want to know what you think, so leave a comment in the comments below on YouTube, keep the discussion going. And if you're listening to the podcast, join us on our social media channels, the various ones we have on Twitter, I almost said Facegram there, that would have been wrong. On Twitter, Facebook and Instagram, using our handle @Autosport. So, Luke, Jess, Codders, thank you very much. Thank you very much for putting up with my attempts on this live broadcast. I very much enjoyed it, I have to say. Thank you very much for that. We'll see you soon, and we're back again with another episode of the Autosport podcast very soon. Thanks very much.